Welcome to Speak Out. I'm Sandy Galef, a member of the New York State Assembly, representing parts of Westchester and parts of Putnam County. And today we're going to be talking about a very, very tough issue. It's about human trafficking, child trafficking. It's such a complicated issue and such a difficult one for all of us to understand and even feel like we have these issues here in our counties. And I've asked a very special person to come and join me today to talk about human and child trafficking. And that is Alison Boak, and you're co-founder and president of the International Organization for Adolescents. And I know you've done other things too, but and also you're on the Pound Ridge Town Board. So you know, you have some government experience. So just tell me a little bit about, I mean, here we are, we're in the suburbs of New York City, and you know, you just think that trafficking isn't going on. What, I mean, it's something that I don't think we think about every day, and we can't even understand how it could be so local and in our communities. And we read about it in the paper, other places, and so on, but it's really here.
It is. It's right here in our own backyard in Westchester County. I live in Pound Ridge, New York, and a couple years ago we had a case right down the street from where I live. A gentleman who is a famous author was posing on the internet as a woman, and he was recruiting young women from other countries using sites that are set up for au pairs or nannies, and he was recruiting for an assistant. And he would lure the women over, posing as other women that were working with him, saying how great the work conditions were, how good money you'd make, and things of that nature. And he would drive to the airport and pick them up and bring them to his home in Pound Ridge, where he would force them to work and sexually abuse the women. And he actually was convicted last year, and today is actually his sentencing. I haven't heard how it went yet, but this really brought home in Westchester County that it really can happen anywhere. Pound Ridge is a very small, quiet community, home to barely 5,000 residents, pretty rural, not much going on there. And to find a case of international trafficking right down the street from me really brought home what I've been out globally working in 22 countries for the past 20 years, telling people that it absolutely can happen. It's in your neighborhood, it's in your backyard.
Well, it was, I know in Albany we had a press conference back a number of years ago when we were dealing with the human trafficking bill that we were going to pass in the Assembly. And we had a woman come to testify that she had been brought up from Mexico with a gentleman that she thought was going to be her boyfriend. And as soon as she was picked up at the airport or however she got in, all of her identification was taken away from her. And she ended up being a prostitute. Not that that was in her plan of action at all, but she was forced to do this. And it wasn't until she had a roommate in that activity that killed herself that she decided she had to come forward. And I thought she was so brave to come forward. And but again, you know, that was New York City, and you know, you always think of things may go on in a big city where people aren't looking, but you're talking about in an individual house, in the country, with somebody that probably had some wealth, and you know, the ability to do this kind of thing. So I guess, as you say, it really
can
happens everywhere.
It can be anywhere. And
Right.
we're just about to launch IOFA, together with the Office for Children and Family Services. We're about to launch next week a new program called Child Right New York. And this program, IOFA, started in Illinois, which also has what's called safe harbor legislation, which is legislation that explicitly states that children who are involved in commercial sexual exploitation are victims rather than criminals or juvenile delinquents. And we're about to launch a statewide project here in New York State, really looking at the issue of child trafficking, both child sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And we picked 5 pilot counties to launch this project in: Monroe, Erie, Onondaga, Westchester, and parts of New York City. And we've been having, for about the past 6 months, biweekly calls with child welfare agencies in all these 5 counties. We've also been working with anti-trafficking organizations in these different counties. And I can tell you that trafficking is happening all over New York State, whether it be a rural agricultural area like near Buffalo, Rochester, or one of the larger cities. It really can be found in any community. So it's really important that on shows like this we get the word out about what is human trafficking, what does it look like, how to recognize it, and then what to do if you think you suspect human trafficking. Because we all can be in a position to witness this crime and to do something about it. In fact, I often joke that it's difficult for me to go on vacation with my family because whether I'm in the United States or overseas, I'm undoubtedly running into potentially trafficking cases, and of course I have to do something which can derail our vacation plans for hours or days.
So going back to the person in Pound Ridge, now how was he found out? I mean, I'm sure there are different ways for people to report or to investigate or to see. Was there something that occurred that would prompt?
Well, it's interesting because my understanding is that there had actually been over the years several police calls to that house, but every time they went, they knew something wasn't quite right, and that's often what happens in human trafficking. You feel like something just isn't quite right, but you can't necessarily put your finger on what is going on. So our local police department went there several times over several years for different calls and couldn't quite figure out what was going on. But this particular time, my understanding is that one of the young women that he had trafficked somehow saw on the computer what was going on. And so she made a call. I believe she was from Hungary, and so she made a call to someone that she knew, and then they called the Pound Ridge Police Department and tipped them off that something was going on. And what really made a difference this time is that when the Pound Ridge Police Department went to this house, they actually separated the victims because remember there were 3 young women living in his home. And oftentimes traffickers tell their victims what they have to say if law enforcement comes because of course if you're from another country, one of your biggest fears is law enforcement. They're going to deport you, you're going to be arrested, you're going to have some sort of really big problem. But when they separate the victims, they're more likely to talk and to tell what's really going on. So that's when they first got a sense of what the story really was. But in most trafficking cases, it takes a number of interviews with the victims to understand fully what is going on, because as you can imagine, often these people are very traumatized. They've been through a lot. They've had all kinds of threats, force, and coercion used against them, and they're traumatized. So it often will take them working with qualified social workers over a period of time to really process what's happened to them, to understand their rights, and to understand that they're actually a victim of a crime. Sad to say that most trafficking victims that I've worked with over my near 20-year career, they're really just looking for a better life and to work. And oftentimes it's very difficult for them to come to terms with the fact that they became a victim.
And their choices were not good.
Right, exactly.
But they didn't necessarily know that. All right, so that was the police that was contacted. Are there people in a community that might check on what's going in a house, or what does the public do? What are the signs? Are there signs for the public?
Yeah, there are signs. This is why the 2007 human trafficking law that was passed in New York State is so critical. I've been training police and law enforcement for a very long time. And one of the issues that we had was that when you only had a federal law, which we've had since 2000 here in the United States, it's very difficult for local law enforcement because they're the ones that are best positioned in our community to see these cases most often. They're in people's homes, they're in people's places of work, they're on our street corners, they're all around, they're like the eyes and ears of the community. But for so long, they didn't actually have a crime that they could prosecute, or whatever the right word is, that they could address because it was a federal law. So with this 2007 law, it actually gave us the tools to train local law enforcement on the crime at a state level. And that's really important. So you had asked about what are the signs to look for. So it's different with children and with adults. I mean, you mentioned one already. Somebody who has their papers confiscated, when they don't have their key documents in their possession, that's often a sign that someone is controlling them. Another thing we see, for example, is that the traffickers will pick their workers up and drive them to work, drop them off, and then pick them up again at the end of the day and drive them back home. And they're often kept under guard or under lock and key. So I heard someone just told me yesterday that there was reports of a nail salon, I believe in Mount Kisco, where they had seen women being dropped off at a nail salon in the morning to work, and they were dressed in clothes like from a nightclub, and then they were seeing them being picked up later at the end of the day. So these are the types of signs that you want to look for just being out in the community. Other signs might include if someone has a child in the house that doesn't go to school or doesn't participate in activities like the other children do.
Right.
You know, also with our proximity to New York City, we have the issue of trafficking within the diplomatic community. Many diplomats are afforded the opportunity to bring over staff from their home country, and they may bring someone over who is essentially in a slave-like situation here. Maybe they're a minor, they're not allowed to go to school, maybe they're an adult, but they're working such hours without the pay and things that they would have here under, you know, some sort of exploitation and fear. So it's quite a complicated issue in terms of identification. But what I always say when I'm training people is, when in doubt, do something, because it's always better to have someone look at this case and then say, oh, it's not trafficking, than to miss that one opportunity where a person may be able to escape out of their situation.
Right.
And in West,
but that is hard too.
Yes.
I suppose it's like anybody reporting domestic violence
That's right.
or child abuse in a different way, because they always, if it is a neighbor and you think something is happening, you know, and you do report, which you really need to do, because it's important to settle the problem one way or another. But I think people are always hesitant getting involved in their neighbors' issues, I suppose.
That's right.
But you encourage them to do it if they think something is going
yes,
wrong.
absolutely.
Right.
And luckily, the more and more that we are doing training, the more likely you are to get a proper response. I mean, I remember one time where I called the police because I thought I had encountered a trafficking situation. And I said, I need to talk to someone about human trafficking. And they literally forwarded my call to the tickets department, like the traffic violations department. But now many police departments are starting to have specialized units. There was a training this summer out of the New York State Police Academy. There's a lot of training for first responders going on. Next week we're having a training specifically addressing the issue of child trafficking for both first responders and for social workers.
Do we have more, would you say, in New York or in Westchester or whatever, do we have more child trafficking or human trafficking of adults? What would you say?
You know, actually, I don't know the absolute numbers, but in terms of reporting, there's been much less child trafficking reported, and I actually wanted to share some of the most updated statistics. I just got these this month from OTDA, which is part of New York State government that's responsible for overseeing the trafficking and implementing the trafficking legislation for New York State. And since we have had our New York State law in 2007, there have only been 39 minors that have been confirmed, which means they have gone through the official administrative process of being certified as a victim in New York State. And of those 39 minors, 37 of them were female and 2 were male. And of those numbers, 36 were involved in sex trafficking, 3 in labor trafficking. And we found that 6 of those 39 cases were foreign-born, and the rest were actually born here in the United States.
What about the labor trafficking? Is that putting people to work in unreasonable conditions and that kind of thing as children? Is that what that is about?
Labor trafficking can take place in a host of different types of services and industries. It most often happens in industries that are kind of low paid or low skilled, such as restaurant work, construction work, different types of salons, hair salons, nail salons. But it really can take place in almost any type of industry. There's even been cases of doctors from Russia being trafficked to the United States. So I always say you really have to think outside the box. Although disproportionately women, children, and people of low income are trafficked, trafficking victims have been documented as young as 2 years old and as old as women in their 70s. And it can come from any kind of country, anywhere around the world. The U.S. State Department puts out a report every June where they actually rank the efforts of every country to address the issue of human trafficking. And recently they've started putting out a report where they assess our own efforts here in the United States.
Are we doing pretty well?
Well,
or not?
We are. You know, New York, or the United States, is actually a leader on the issue of human trafficking. And I would say some of our federal government funding is among the most generous for the issue of human trafficking. I mean, we have so far to go. This issue is still such in its infancy stage compared to, say, domestic violence and how far that's come over the years. So we're really still learning a lot about what trafficking looks like. We're constantly seeing new types of cases that we'd never seen before. So it's definitely an evolving field, if we want to call it that.
Right. Now, is it, I guess it's more women and children than men.
That's what the
Right.
statistics show. But what I say is that, you know, you often find what you're looking for. And most of the efforts in our country to date have been focused on sex trafficking. If you look at what you see in the media, it's more about sex trafficking. You know, sex sells. It's a little bit more exciting and than labor trafficking. But I know that here in Westchester County, we've seen a lot of labor trafficking, as well as across New York State, and it really depends where you are. So, for example, our partners in Buffalo area, they see predominantly labor trafficking. In fact, they, as of a couple months ago, they hadn't had a case of commercial sexual exploitation of children yet. I'm sure it is there, they're just not tuned into that. So it's really about what you're looking for. There was a study done in New York City some years back that actually found more boys than girls involved in the commercial sex industry in New York. So I think we're really at the beginning stages of collecting our data and understanding, you know, this phenomenon.
Right. I suppose pornography, you know, is an area that both boys and girls can be locked into. Let's just, there was such a big case in Ohio with a man that had 3 women living in his house, and one of them decided to leave, which was marvelous because that opened the door for everybody else. Is that considered human trafficking? Was that kidnapping or?
Yeah, you know, for there to be, that's a very good question. For human trafficking, it's very different than other crimes that are similar. I like to look at it as a kind of a spectrum of abuse. And there has to be certain elements that are there for the crime of human trafficking to be met. And that includes basically harboring, getting, somehow controlling a person. And then they have to employ force, fraud, or coercion to get them to perform some sort of service. So the service component in the force, fraud, and coercion is really what separates it from regular exploitation. I don't know enough about the details of that case to know for sure if it was trafficking or not, but my initial guess would be that it's not trafficking, but it was abuse and exploitation. Now, if these abusers had brought in money, had brought in other people and were charging money for them to abuse these women, then that would bring it to the level of trafficking because they're basically forcing them into performing a service for proceeds, for benefit. So it's a very nuanced kind of crime, which makes it extremely difficult to prove, extremely difficult to identify, and extremely difficult to understand. It's not the kind of crime that's very cut and dry. There's always, you know, some interpretation and understanding of the facts to determine if it is indeed human trafficking or not.
Let's think about all those individuals that have been trafficked. They all have families. And, you know, what is the implication for the families? You know, you read the reports and somebody's been taken and later on you might find that they've, you know, been in a prostitution ring or whatever. what is all the impact? Do you work with families? Do you see them?
You know, it's very difficult, and it's, again, very, very complex. I mean, you have the issue that oftentimes families are threatened, and they're used also as leverage to keep a person under the control of the trafficker. So there was a case in the United States where some Estonian women in their 60s were trafficked here to clean hotel rooms. And when they kind of were getting fed up and starting to figure out, you know, that they wanted to leave, the traffickers essentially said, listen, we know where your sons live. And in fact, we did get a report at IOFA that one of the sons had been badly beaten. So they use the family members in the home country, if it's a victim from another country, to control the situation here as it is. But it gets even more complex, because oftentimes the traffickers have sexually assaulted their trafficking victims and have children together with their victims. So as you can imagine, that creates a very complex situation. One thing that we do have in our federal anti-trafficking law that I think sets us apart from many other countries around the world is that we have this thing called the T visa. So when someone is in the United States on account of trafficking and they get certified as a bona fide victim of human trafficking in the United States, they get this T visa, and then they can actually petition for what are called their derivatives. It seems like kind of a terrible word, but what derivatives actually means is their family members, their close family members who may be at risk for harm from the traffickers, and they can actually petition and bring them over to the United States. They can petition to bring their children over, et cetera. And many countries don't allow anything like that. And I think that's a real important part of the healing process as well.
Right. So are most of the people trafficked, are they from other countries and maybe with a different language? Is that what makes them more vulnerable, or are we just seeing it in different ways?
You know, I don't like to compare and say there's more domestic trafficking, which are more U.S. citizens or people living here, versus international. We don't really know enough, I would say, about the data. What I could say is that it happens in both cases, people from other countries being trafficked here, as well as Americans or people that live here being trafficked around the United States. And there have been some limited cases of Americans actually being trafficked to other countries, though that's not very prevalent at all. So I'm not sure which is really the most predominant. You asked another question.
Well, I'm just thinking about legislation in the future. We have federal legislation, we have state legislation. I know we probably need to improve what we did in Albany a number of years ago. Are there recommendations coming out of the organizations that you're involved with that will, lead us in a different direction?
There's actually some legislation right now that is waiting for the governor's signature. So there's after the 2007 human trafficking law, another law was passed that was called the Safe Harbor Act, and that was in 2008, which became effective in 2010. And New York, with California on our heels, were really the first states in the nation to implement this kind of law. And this was a really important law because what we were seeing happening in the field is that minors under the age of 18 who were involved with commercial sex were really being treated as juvenile delinquents or bad kids. And what this law did was really say that these children are victims of a crime. They should not be dealt with by the justice system. They should be dealt with by the child welfare and the family court system. So it made a big shift in policy in terms of how these children are treated. And there's a bill, I know the assembly number, it's 5071A, and I believe that it's been passed through both the Assembly and the Senate. And what this would do is it would extend the age up to age 18 that would give these protections to children. Because in the Safe Harbor Act, it only applies to children under the age of 16 and leaves kids from 16 to 18 at the discretion of the courts.
Right.
And as you can imagine, a lot of the children are around 16, 17, 18. That's a real vulnerable age. So it would be really important to extend these protections up to this age group.
And that's probably an age where if anybody is to drift off from their families and end up in the wrong place, that could be an age where that happens.
You know, the other issue that we have is that particularly with child trafficking, it was estimated that to actually fully implement the Safe Harbor law across New York State would cost $10 million. And there's no direct funding attached to this legislation. We have some funding this year, but it's basically dependent on the legislature, so it's not guaranteed, you know, to last any time beyond what we've gotten for this year. So that's another remedy that really needs to be fixed, that it's one thing to say this is a crime and here's how we need to fix it, but if we're really serious about addressing child trafficking in New York State, we need to give service providers the resources that they need to provide shelter and supports to these kids.
Right, because you can just imagine a child when they first, as you said earlier, as they're first removed from the perpetrator and so on, that the emotions and the instability, really, or getting back into society or whatever, and dealing with their parents that maybe they haven't seen, and all of that is just a very compelling period of time, which does mean that the government is there to help them in that kind of program.
And we also have the issue where many kids who do end up in commercial sexual exploitation, they had problems at home, which forced them to kind of run away, making them very vulnerable. And so the traffickers kind of filled a void in their life, giving them love, protection, food, you know, things that a parent or a guardian would normally supply. So without service providers really be armed to offer something to these children, we can't compete with the traffickers. The traffickers have more to offer these children than we would, you know, as social workers and child welfare workers and people that really want to try to help these kids get their lives back on track.
This is such a really difficult area to deal with, and I don't know how you got into this. So just in a minute, just tell me you said 20-some years, but how did you do this?
After I graduated from college, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Latvia, which is located right next door to Russia. And I spent 3 years there. I learned Latvian, I learned Russian. I worked with kids from elementary school all the way up to university, and I never saw anything about this issue called human trafficking. And I came back to New York to go to grad school, and my first month back, there was a story on the front page of the New York Times called Naive Cargo. And it was about a young woman from Latvia, where I had just spent 3 years, who was trafficked to Israel and basically brought all around the country and forced into prostitution in brothels all, you know, throughout Israel. And I thought, oh, this must be one of those horrible, crazy outlier cases that makes the front page of the New York Times. So I didn't, you know, I thought it was horrible and I was upset, but I didn't think it was a big problem. And then I learned about a month later that it was a problem that was really prevalent across the country and in Latvia. I went back to Latvia. I organized a seminar with the help of the United Nations, and at the end of the day, there were literally a line of dozens of people wanting to hear and share what their stories were, what clients they had that were missing, kids that had gone missing, people they knew who had gone to work to another country and just disappeared. So I knew that
that's how you got into this.
This is what I wanted to do.
Right. Well, that's great. And if anybody needs any information about this issue, I'm assuming that we put something up on our on the screen.
They could visit our website, which is www.iofa.org, or the Office for Children and Family Services, which is OCFS. Or they can call my cell, which is 917-757-4180.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Allie. Thanks you so much. And thank you very much for watching and learning much more about this very important issue that we face in New York State and in our local communities, as well as around the world. So if there are any questions you have for me, just give me a call at my office, 914-941-1111. Thank you so very much for watching. Have a good evening.